In this episode, we're setting up Metasound sound effects for our gameplay ability pickups. Different sound effects for different types of gameplay abilities. And then also, if we already have that ability, different sound for that too. Hey guys, welcome to today's episode, and today we're finishing up special effects for what we started last episode for our gameplay ability pickups. And for a while I've been thinking how and when we get into Metasounds, because I know Metasounds is now the recommended way of doing all sounds in Unreal Engine. But to be honest, for all the sounds that we've done thus so far in this series, I just haven't felt that we've reached the threshold of complexity that would warrant switching over to Metasounds. And this is the first situation that we've run into in this series where I think there's a strong advantage to using Metasounds. So with the first third of this episode, we're going to start with a conventional sound setup with sound cues, and over the course of that I think you'll understand the limitations to sound cues and where Metasounds would be really helpful in this case. And I just want to preface all this by saying I am the furthest thing from an expert in Metasounds. I am literally figuring this out as I go along. So if you have better ways of doing what we're setting up in this episode, please post in the comments below. So here are the key concepts for this episode. And even if you're not following this series and you just want an overview of Metasounds, by the end of this episode, I think you'll understand the basics of Metasounds, but also the situations that warrant using Metasounds over a conventional sound cue setup. So let's get to it. So I originally tried all sorts of sounds for these effects, and quite honestly, they just sounded tacky. So we're just going to use the same sounds that we set up in episode 27 and 40 respectively. And if you're not interested in checking out those episodes, that's totally fine. There's a link in the description below to the spreadsheet of all the sounds that we're using in this series. Every single sound that we're using, they're all free, and these come from Zapsplat. So you can just click the links in the spreadsheet, it'll take you right to them. But if you are following this series, then follow along with me here. So we're going to go to our content drawer, over to content, into sound, and then gameplay abilities, and then air. And we're going to duplicate the air channel cue here that we set up in episode 40. So right click, duplicate. And I'm going to name it example pickup cue. And this is not going to be the final state because we're going to switch over to Metasounds, but this is what we're going to start with. So now under sound here in the bottom left, I'm just going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this gameplay ability pickups. So now back in the air folder, I'm going to drag that example pickup cue over to gameplay ability pickups. Move here. So let's open up this sound cue, but then the second thing we got to do is let's go back to the sound that we set up in episode 27. So under sound, gameplay abilities, fire. So we set up these flamethrower channel sounds in episode 27. Pick either one. I'm going to pick channel 2 here, drag it in. So under mixer here, we're going to add an additional node, and then we're going to connect up our flamethrower channel 2. For every single wave player here, we're just going to set it, make sure it's not looping. This one, uncheck. These two, uncheck. And the last thing in the mixer node, so expand the input volume here, we're going to make our flamethrower channel a little bit louder, 1.7. And this is the sound that we're going to use for our fire ability pickups. And the other thing I should mention is because we duplicated this sound cue, it's using the spatialized air ability attenuation. If you don't want to check out episode 40, let me just go into that. It's very simple. All right, that's it for our sound cue. So now let's trigger the sound on pickup. So let's navigate over to our third person character blueprint, and we're going to build on all the setup that we started last episode. Just double click there. And I'm going to expand under gameplay abilities and go under the gameplay ability pickup effect function. And we'll come to the end of the function. And then from here, we are going to spawn sound attached. And where is it going to be attached to? Well, it's going to be attached to the mesh. So we can copy it here, connect it up. And the sound is going to be our example pickup cue that we just set up. And I'm going to expand this here because that way I can make sure it's set to auto destroy. Yeah, all that looks good. Doesn't need attenuation because it's already got it in the sound cue. Over here on the right, we're going to promote the output to a variable. So promote to variable. And if I scroll down on the left under variables, I've got the new var under components here. We're going to right click, rename. This is going to be our power up sound, one word. But as it currently stands, this sound's just going to be an even level as soon as it's picked up. And what I really want is I want the sound to correspond to the Niagara effect. So I want it to start very quietly, ramp up very quickly, and then back down again as the Niagara effect fades. So in order to do that, you probably guessed this already because we've done this a ton in this series, we're going to do a timeline. So we'll go back to the event graph. I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to come down all the way to the bottom, right click, search for timeline. All the way at the bottom, add timeline. I'm going to call this ability power up sound. And we'll double click to go into that, and we'll add a float track, add float. This is going to be our volume, so I'm going to call it volume. Length is going to be a lot shorter in 5 seconds, so it's only going to be about a 2.2 second effect. And I just got that length of time through a lot of trial and error. So now we can zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to right click in 3 places, add a key. So all the way at the start, all the way at the end. And then slightly past the 0.25 second mark, we're going to add another key. So the middle one here, I'm going to give it a value of 1.5. And then I can click over here to zoom to fit horizontal. Actually, zoom to fit vertical. That's a little bit better. Then I'll select our first diamond here. This is going to be set to times 0. And you probably know what's coming next. Right click. We're going to auto tangent all of these. So right click over here, auto tangent. And the last one up here, auto tangent. And this is just going to smooth out the curve a little bit. And actually this one, I'm just going to increase the speed at which the volume goes down over time. So just turn it a little bit that way. And also maybe move it over slightly. So instead of 0.266, maybe like 0.28, 0.3. How about that? And this one, I'm going to scale down a little bit faster, 2.1 seconds down to 0. All right, back in our event graph, what we're going to do is get a reference to our power up sound audio component, get. I'm going to right click. We're going to convert this to a validated get, which we did a few episodes ago. And all this is doing is it's doing an is valid check right on the variable. We'll drag out a pin here, set volume multiplier. And our volume is going to be right from our timeline. Add a little reroute. So we've got our timeline, but how do we actually call our timeline to scale up that sound? Well, we got to call it, right? So I'm going to go back to the function we were just in, gameplayability pickup effect. And then directly after our power up sound, then we can call the timeline. So it should be directly under your components here. We can drag in a reference to that timeline, and then we could play from start. Connect this up here, compile and save this, and we are ready to test out the sound with our gameplayability pickup. All right, so as this currently stands, it's a fire sounding effect because we raised up the volume of that flamethrower channel to be 1.7 times normal volume. So I'm just going to run over our fireball pickup here, and we'll see what it sounds like. It's a pretty cool sounding effect, but the problem isn't the sound effect itself. The problem is variability. So what I mean by that is if we're going to run over additional abilities, then as it currently stands, we would need to do sophisticated blueprint logic to update the pitch, update the volume if we want each ability sound to be different, or we need to create a ton of sound cues. And then the other problem is if I run over the same ability, like I discussed last episode, I basically want the ability pickup intensity to jump up 10. And in that case, I want the sound to be different, kind of a scaled down version, but I want the intensity of the gameplay ability pickup after it's picked up, I want that to be reflected in the sound effect itself. So the player would know how strong that ability is based on the sound of the pickup. It's also going to be based on the Niagara effect that we set up last episode, but it's nice to have that sound scale with it. So like I said, we could set up a ton of sound cues for this, a lot of blueprint logic where we're altering the pitch and the volume, but that's all we can do, right? We can't do any other fancy sound effects. And so this is why I think Metasounds is going to work really well, because if we ever have, for example, abilities that are both fire and air, or fire and water, I guess fire and water wouldn't mix, but let's say we have like a fire and an earth ability. Like we take something from the earth like a rock and we light it on fire. Then with Metasounds, I could use elements of sounds from both earth abilities and fire abilities and combine that into one awesome thing. So that's what I'm envisioning for the future. We're not going to get to that level of sophistication this episode, but that's the direction we're going down. So let's start by setting up this same exact sound effect in Metasounds, and then we'll expand upon it for the rest of our gameplay abilities. So the first step is make sure you have the Metasounds plugin enabled. So if we come up to settings here and then plugins and just search for Metasound, and mine was already enabled, so we're all set, but if not, just check it, restart Unreal Engine. So now we're going to go back to our content drawer and back to the gameplay ability pickup folder that we started under sound. And we're going to right click, and under sounds, we're going to create a new Metasound source. And this is basically the equivalent of a sound cue. And I'm going to name this gameplay ability pickup _ MSS for Metasound source. Go into that. So I'll just give you a really quick tour of Metasounds here. So in the top left corner, this is organized just like every other blueprint. We have our components, we have our inputs and our outputs. So input is what's going into the Metasound, output is the actual sound, and then on finished, which is basically the blueprint way of saying the sound is done. And as it currently stands, our output is just mono output. So if you're familiar with stereo versus mono sounds, we're going to get the sound in both of our ears here. But you can do all sorts of outputs here. And I am by no means a sound expert, but at least for this sound that we're starting with, a pickup sound, we can keep it mono because that sound is going to be literally on the character, on the player. And the details panel here works the same exact way as any other blueprint. So if I select something and want to change it in the details panel, it's right there. And we're going to create some variables for Metasounds that we're going to end up updating here. But first, let's start by recreating the example pickup cue, and we'll recreate it basically verbatim. So in this pickup cue, we had 4 different sounds that we were using. And to get the wave player in Metasounds, it's much the same way. So we can right click and just search for wave player. And this is also, by the way, how you could get a stereo sound, quad, mono, and we're going to stick with mono. But a stereo would have 2 pins here, and then you'd hook that up to your stereo output. All right, so I'm going to make some space here. Input moved out, wave player up, and I'm going to duplicate this 3 times. So I'll copy this, paste, and then I'll copy both, paste again. And the reason I'm doing that is because we have 4 different sounds from this sound cue. So I can go over to our sound cue and get air channel 1, air channel 2, air channel 3, and flamethrower channel 2. air channel 1, air channel 2. And actually, I'm going to put air channel 3 down here. I'll explain why in just a minute, but let's do flamethrower channel 2 and then air channel 3 down here. And if we're recreating the sound cue exactly, so back in the sound cue, we picked one of these at random for the sound. And so to do that, instead of playing both of these, what we can do is drag out a pin from on play and do a trigger filter. And if I hover over that, it says when triggered randomly sends one of two output triggers based on a given probability. So heads, it's going to play this sound. Tails, it's going to play this sound. Now the probability is 1 here, so it's always going to be the top one. So instead, I'm going to change that to a 0.5. So then the problem is, how do we connect up multiple to our out mono here? And for that, we need what's called a mixer node. So I'm going to make some space here. And I'm actually going to create 2 mixer nodes. I'm going to do a mixer with these 2, and we're going to do a mono mixer of 2, connect up this one too. And this is also how you can change the volume of one sound relative to another. You can just change the gain right here. So 1 is full volume, and 0.5 will be 50% volume. So I'm going to move over here, make a little bit more space, and we're going to do another mixer. And this is going to be 3 because we're going to connect up this, we're going to connect up this one, and our last one. And then I can connect up our out mono right here, and that's our actual sound that's going to play. Now we still have this warning here that we're never telling the Metasound what to do when finished, or that it's actually finishing. And so what I could do is I could just connect up on finished right here, and that should do it. But the way I'm going to set this up is that these 2 up here, these 2 sounds, the air channel sounds, they are always going to play for any game playability pickup, no matter what. But then this one right here is going to be our primary sound, and this one down here is going to be our secondary sound. So every single game playability pickup is always going to have a primary and a secondary, and we're going to change those out with variables. Now, if either the primary or the secondary sound is complete, then I want the output to be finished. And so the way I'm going to do this is drag out a pin. We're going to do a trigger any. So if either of these, if any of these is finished, then it's going to complete the sound. And the last thing I got to do is I got to hook up these 2 right here. So on play, we can also play this, and we can play this. So if you've got all that, then we can save this and let's test it. So you see, as soon as the sound finished, then it stopped because it's looking at either one of these. So if either one finishes, if either one gets triggered, then the entire sound stops playing. And if you wanted to stop the sound only when all the sounds were complete, then what you could do is drag out a pin and you could say trigger accumulates. Come up here and you could do up to 8 sounds. And I suppose you could even do more, but you could just feed in accumulates into each other. And the last thing I want to show here is kind of the class defaults for Metasound. So if we go to source here, this is where we can expand and change the default volume, the default pitch, but also the attenuation. And the attenuation I am going to set. So just like our sound cue where we have the spatialized airability attenuation, I'm going to do the same exact thing here. Spatialized airability attenuation. And the reason I chose this one is because our airability is just playing right around that character. And I want the same thing with the gameplay ability pickups. And I don't want them so loud that they can be heard halfway across the map, but I want them to be heard in that vicinity of the pickup. So now we got the basics of our Metasound up and running. So let's assign this to our third-person character the same way we did the example pickup cue, and we'll test this out. So back over to our function, the gameplay ability pickup effect function. We're just going to change the spawn sound attached here, gameplay ability pickup MSS. So we'll compile and save this, and we can close out the example pickup cue. We're not going to need that anymore, but let's test this out. All right, moment of truth. So far, so good. But now let's get into the variability that I was talking about before, because what I want to do is I want to switch out the primary and the secondary sounds in Metasounds depending on the type of ability. So in this series thus so far, we have fire abilities and we have air abilities. And I want the fire ability to have a fire sound first, like this one currently does. But if I pick up an air ability, I actually want the fire ability sound to be secondary. So I basically want to switch out the prominence of that. And so what we can do is in the Metasounds directly, we can promote each of those sounds, each of those waves to a variable, and then we can just switch out those variables in our blueprint when we call the gameplay ability pickup function. So back in our Metasound, I'm just going to drag out a pin here, and we are going to promote it to a graph input. And we're going to rename this wave asset. So right click, rename, we're going to name it our primary sound. And we're going to do the same thing for this one. So drag out and promote to graph input, change the name of this one to our secondary sound. And so to make this actually a primary versus a secondary sound, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the volume of each. So the gain for the first one, it's really the second here, but it's the first one in terms of the primary and secondary. This one's going to be 1.5, and then the gain for the second, we're going to lower it. So it's only going to be 60% of normal volume. So the primary sound will always be more than twice as loud as the secondary, but it's still going to be there. So now the question is, how do we pass in what we want to be the primary sound versus the secondary sound? And for that, let's go back to our third-person character. And what I'm going to do in the bottom left-hand corner, I'm going to expand our local variables. We're going to create 2 new local variables. We're going to do our local primary sound, And if I select under Boolean instead of Boolean, it's going to be a sound wave, 2 words. This one right here, object reference. And then we can hit plus sign again, and this is going to be our local secondary sound. So now if I come over to the left in the same function, the gameplay ability pickup effect function, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some space after the selector here, because we're going to set the local primary sound and the local secondary sound. We're going to set these to be different based on whether our ability is fire, water, earth, air, etc. And as it currently stands, we only have fire and air abilities, so we only have to worry about those 2 right now. So I'm going to drag in a reference to our local primary sound and set, and then same thing for our secondary. Drag in a reference, set. Connect this up here, connect this up here, connect this up down here. Copy both of these, paste them down below. Connect this up just like this, and like this. Now for our fire sound here, the local primary sound is going to be our flamethrower channel 2. And the secondary sound is going to be our air channel 3. And then we're just going to reverse that right down here. So for air, this is going to be air channel 3 as our primary. And for the secondary, flamethrower channel 2. So now the question is, how do we assign these 2 variables to our Metasound? Like, how do we actually have the Metasound use those? So for that, I'm going to come over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some space between the power up sound and our timeline call, because we need to set these 2 variables. So I can drag out a reference and I can say set wave parameter. And the in name here, it just has to match whatever our name here is. So I'm going to name this no spaces primary sound. And then I can drag in a reference to our local primary sound, connect that up. And now we have to set our second wave parameter, set wave parameter, and connect it up right here. Put in a little reroute, and actually I ended up deleting the wrong one, so connect it up. And a second reroute just for funsies. And then we drag in a reference to our local secondary sound, connect this up. In name secondary sound. All right, so if yours looks like that, then you're all set. Make sure you got your names updated. Make sure your 2 different variables are set here. Make sure they're all connected up to the power up sound. And then connect up your play from start. We still need the volume adjustment in the timeline. So compile and save this, and let's test it out. All right, so first up, air ability. So it's got more of an airy feel to it, but you still get a slight sense of that fire sound with the flamethrower. So now let's try our fireball. Yeah, more of a fire sound. And really whatever sounds you use for this, it's entirely up to you. So I'm just going based on my best instincts for these abilities. But if you have other ideas, I'm all ears. So please post in the comments below. So now, what do we want to have happen when there's just a boost to an ability like we set up last episode? So that's a second Metasound source that we're going to set up now. So for this, we're going to create a second Metasound source. So we'll duplicate this one, rename it gameplay ability boost underscore MSS. So let's go into this one. And for this boost effect Metasound, it's actually going to be a lot simpler than our first one because we're only going to have a single sound. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete out the wave player here, delete this input. We could delete out our secondary sound as well. And I can also delete out these 2. We're not going to need those. Move this down here. But what I am going to do for these boost sounds is I want the pitch to adjust over time. Now there's a bunch of other Metasound sound effects that you could try out. Like if I drag out from add mono here and go under functions, there's a ton of stuff. I am the furthest thing from a sound expert. So a lot of this stuff I played with and I just didn't get a good effect that I really liked. But this is where if you have a lot more experience with sound, feel free to go ham on this, but we're just going to keep it simple. So we're going to do a new input. So I'm going to hit plus sign over here, and this is going to be a float. And I'm going to name this input intensity because it's going to be based on the intensity of the pickup that we acquire. So I can drag in a reference to intensity. And I just experimented with the math on this to see what made the best effect. So what we're going to do is we're going to subtract 100 because by default our intensity is 100 from an ability. And I'm going to move this out, make a little bit more space. And as the ability goes up in strength, so it's going to be 110, then 120, etc. So this is going to be 10 and then 20 coming out of this. So from this, we are going to get an exponent. So I can just hold shift, hit 6 on my keyboard, power float. And whenever you do a power less than 1, it's going to actually make the number smaller. I'm going to make this about 0.7. And then from this, I'm going to subtract 10. So subtract and 10. And so that means at a minimum, this is going to be negative 10. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clamp this then between a minimum of negative 10 and a maximum of 20. So it's never going to be pitch shifted more than 20% upward. So I'm going to come over here to the right and we're just going to move this up, move our mono mixer down. And actually, I probably could change this, but I found that a volume of 1.5, that still works great. So I'm just going to keep it right there, 1.5. I suppose we could just go into our source under sound. We could change our volume here to 1.5. Yeah, I could probably do that. That's cleaner. Delete this out. Connect up out mono. And then also keep this simpler too. So on finished, connect up right here. And so now if you've got all this, then we are ready to use intensity to drive our pitch shift. So let's save our Metasound. We'll come back over to BP third person character. And last episode we created a second function, and that's a gameplay ability boost only effect function. I think I sorted that also under gameplay abilities, this one right here. And so we're going to set it up very similar to what we just did. I'm going to make a tiny bit more room here. We just need a single local variable. Hit plus sign down here. This is going to be our local primary sound, and it should still be of type sound wave. And then I can drag in a reference to that, set, and connect it up to the top one. Connect it up down here. Copy and paste, and also connect it up to the air abilities. This one's going to be our flamethrower channel 2. This one's going to be our air channel 3. And then move over to the right, we're going to do the same exact kind of thing, but I think it's faster to just duplicate from what we just set up. So if I go back into gameplay ability pickup effect function, everything from the spawn sound attached here over to play from start, copy all that, go back over to gameplay ability boost only effect, paste that in, connect it up here, make sure to switch out our gameplay ability boost MSS. Then over here on the right, so we can delete out our local secondary sound, we don't need that, delete out this. Connect up just like this. Now there's one issue that you might experience here, and that is if you have multiple pickups that occur before the first sound stops playing. And the reason that that's an issue is because this power up sound variable is not an array, it's a single variable. And so if it gets updated while another sound is playing, then it's going to basically interrupt the previous sound. But I don't think that's going to be an issue for the game that we're designing, because I think our gameplay ability pickups are going to be far enough away that within that 2.5 second range, we're not going to be able to reach a second ability. But if it does become an issue, then I'll make sure to address it in this series. But the last thing we need to do here before we actually compile and save is make a little bit more space before play from start, because we need to set the intensity input that we set in our Metasound here. So we can drag out a reference to power up sound, set float parameter, just like that. And one thing I found when dragging out a pin is in some of these its target is audio component, and others its target is audio parameter controller interface. Either one worked for me. If there's an advantage to doing it one way versus the other, please let me know in the comments below. But both of them worked for me just fine. So I can move this over here, connect this up just like this, connect this up here, put in a little reroute. And second reroute, stickler for reroutes. And then we also have to connect up our intensity float variable. So we set that up last episode, local intensity. Connect this up here. And our in name is going to be intensity. All right, so if you've got all that, make sure you've switched out your sound here. So it should be the gameplay ability boost effect. Then we can compile and save. But before we test, let's just get a string of gameplay ability pickup actors. So I'm going to select our fireball to start. Copy that, paste. And I'll move them all a little bit closer. And I'll just copy it multiple times, basically paste them in a string. And like I mentioned, if we don't wait the 2 seconds or so for the one ability to finish playing its sound before doing a second ability pickup, then we might run into some issues. But realistically, over the course of the game, not going to be a problem. All right, so that looks good. Let's play. All right, fireball. So we get our first sound with the full effect. Now, moment of truth, second sound. Totally different sound effects. So let's listen for a pitch change as we pick up subsequent ones. Yeah, so it's getting a little bit lighter every single time. Let's check with air. Here's the first air ability. Ooh, I like that one. A little bit higher. A little bit higher still. So it's going to keep going up until it hits that maximum. I think it's a 20% pitch shift. But if you have other ideas, other effects and Metasounds to make these pickup sound effects even better, I'd be really interested. So once again, please post in the comments below. The only problem that I'm running into is as the pitch shift keeps going up, the sound might not be long enough in duration to actually play out the entire 2.2 seconds. So here's what I mean. I've already picked up a bunch of fireball abilities, so now I'm going to pick up a 5th or 6th one. See how it cuts off there? So I've got a really hacky solution to this if this happens to you. So all we're going to do is back in our gameplay ability boost, I'm going to take our wave player mono, I'm just going to duplicate it, we're going to move our primary sound down, we're going to connect it up to both, and as soon as this one is on finished, it's going to play our second one. So it's just going to be one continuous sound. I know that that's really hacky, but it worked just fine for me. So with our 2 out monos here, I can just do a mixer, mono mixer 2, connect up this one to this and our out right there, and then connect up our on finished right like this, and then also connect up our intensity to our pitch shift down here and save that. So final test. All right, initial pickup. Now the pitch shift upward. Yep, that did it. Last thing, and this is only necessary if you're following along with the AI portion of this series, but back in our third-person character blueprint, all the way at the end of these two functions, the gameplay ability boost only effect function and the gameplay ability pickup effect function, we need to add a report noise event. And I'm adding that all the way at the end of the chain after play from start here. Now for the noise location, I'm just going to get a reference to our mesh, and then from the mesh, I'm going to get world location, connect this up here. The loudness, I'm going to set to 100. I thought about making the loudness be based on the intensity of the gameplay ability pickup, but I don't want the loudness to be so loud that it could be heard halfway across the map, so we'll keep it consistent at 100. Max range, we're keeping at 0 to give it unlimited max range, but it's still limited by the perceiver's hearing. And the instigator, I'm just going to get a reference to self. Connect this up. Last thing, tag, this is going to be a character sound. And by the way, if you don't know where I'm getting all this stuff, you could just check 3 episodes ago where we started AI perception hearing. So I'm going to copy all of this, and for our gameplay ability pickup effect, right at the end of this function too, and then connect this up. Compile and save. So that wraps up our episode for today. And in our next episode, you probably noticed the performance problems that have been occurring over the AI episodes, and we're finally going to start rectifying that next episode. We're creating finally our second level of this game. And this level, I really do envision it as alpha prototyping for gameplay. And next episode is very simple. We're just setting up our ocean here with some foam, optional of course, and a basic landscape. We'll do some basic sculpting, some material stuff at the end of the episode, but primarily it's focused on the ocean. So I hope to see you there.